To the sixth and final session of Transcending Contempt. The format is going to be a little bit different this time around. So we'll begin as we usually do, which is breaking up into groups of three for discussion for the first 20 minutes. And then at 9:20, we'll gather back together both the folks who are joining us on Zoom and in person. And at 9:20, rather than going into a discussion, I'll go right into my sixth and final teaching, which will be a summary teaching and then also laying out a potential way forward or an invitation to a way forward to each of us. And I'll explain what that is. And I'm going to share what I believe are the sort of, now having learned myself, having taught, what I think are the clearest takeaway practices. I think there's two that are probably most helpful for each of us, and then a third is a choose your own adventure. And so I'll outline what that looks like. So then we will go to back into small groups. So that'll be the conclusion of the teaching. And all right, Margaret Lee, is that possible to mute that or?
I got it canceled.
Okay, it's hard for folks to hear both.
Very fine. Sweetie, can I help you with that?
No, I think she's going to be okay. And so we'll have that, and then that'll actually be the concluding sort of teaching that goes up on YouTube, because then we're going to break back into groups of three with the question of what next? What can I do to actually be a beacon of light and love in 2024? What have I learned in Transcending Contempt that I'm going to take forward, and what can I do to help me continue to grow in what I've learned here? And then finally, around 9:55 or so, we'll conclude with some Q&A, and then it'll be 10 o'clock. I'm going to be inviting you to consider joining a small group, maybe either on Zoom or in person through March. And those of you who want to follow through on that suggestion, I'm going to invite to meet me here at 10:15 in this corner so we can sort of facilitate and make that all possible. Clear enough? All right, so why don't we break into groups of three, and then we'll reconvene as a whole group with folks from Zoom at 9:20 for the final teaching. The two questions that you're going to be considering in your groups of three are the homework, as it were. I'll wait so everybody can hear.
We got to get our instructions first.
I know, I'm just waiting so that Margaret Lee so everybody can actually hear. All right, so the two questions that you're considering from last week are, this is so hard, race, period, your thoughts, period, 6 words. What are your 6 words? That's question number 1. And then question number 2 is, did you look at another human being and think to yourself, this is a person, all in capital letters, the theotropic enigma piece? And what was that like? And what did you learn? So please break into groups of 3, and we will reconvene at 9:20.
Could you repeat the second question?
Did you have an experience of looking at another human being and thinking to yourself, this is a person? Which is that way of revering another human being as made in the image and likeness of God. And what was that like? All right, please break into your groups of 3, and we'll reconvene at 9:20.
when it struck me, because I'm hearing racial tension, and I'm hearing all this misinformation. It is really hitting home. I think people are too nice about it. It's really big. Okay, we're doing our 6 words that we were told to get together, and then we're contemplating that. And okay, you can repeat yours.
All people create equal alongside creation.
Probably hard to do better than that.
But he was teaching you to, like Christopher was saying about human, regarding people as human, not as a category. Rachel, do you have one? That's okay.
I don't have a sort of thing, but I was like trying to think of one on the spot because I was really struggling to find something like particular to race, but something that comes to mind, like even as I hear all the words, loved by God, next by Him, and just like the meaning of
Oh, yeah, but I'm sure everybody knows that.
about like they are made to experience God's love. But then when we recognize that, like we follow Him, so that's what people around us.
And we are the hair of God, so that puts us in a position of the implementation.
And it really goes back to how you look at someone's face. When you see that they are neutrophic, neutrophic, in other words, they are God's different. They are focusing on God and give Him gratitude and respect that
Well, I'm a little related. I think here, anxious people that go astray. It's like walking.
Called out.
Maybe begin to, but it's black versus black is extremely racist. Seems to me that wokeism is largely driven it's like gentrified black Muslim doctrine. Instead of white devils, we're white Muslims. Anyway, just this whole concept.
So I think mine is just taken off from my understanding of what Harper said we're doing. My one was challenge. They try to get
Rachel, did you hear the memo? What?
Well, the article was basically the plaintiff was engaged in, hey, these folks aren't so bad after all. That's quite remarkable, but kind of like, to be in the South and be able to make those statements.
So it's actually in Charleston, South Carolina, that I discovered Southern cuisine. Not many months later, I got to go to New Orleans. What's that?
You just brought up the white devil. Well, in the U.S., whites, like the
Yeah,
devil.
we always say, we drank iced tea growing up.
What image is that for you?
Iced tea was a regular summertime drink, but we never drank the
Go
sweet.
towards the light. The light is good. Go to the dark, that's good. And that can make it very racist. But then you look at like in Asia, the evil eye. The evil eye is blue. And you do not have people with blue eyes in Asia.
Well,
So that is
you know, it's such a loaded term.
so
I mean, politically, I
we
can
have
see
all these layers
of fear. I can see there's compromise.
How do you
maintain
that's scary because it's unknown because it's different things. And so because I'm
which has nothing to do with where someone's coming from. But at the same time, just because someone else is talking about a people, usually don't necessarily
So what is the corporate heritage?
Views from hunters. Hunters.
I mean, I've never experienced it, but I think my great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents experienced it.
We got a bunch of people from New Orleans in our parish. There's Chris. Yeah, what's his name? Chris.
Tilly. Chris Tilly.
Chris Tilley. We got New Orleans now.
And Matt Samonson. And Candy Kreider.
Matt what?
Well,
Samonson.
the way it's written is, I think that's probably
Matt and Candace had a bean cook-off last year. It was awesome. We were all the winners.
She's making red beans right now for tomorrow.
Fantastic.
Which is where we're at today.
I think it's hard
See
not
people
to
getting shot instead of going into a house. If they don't, if the kids don't know you're white, there's going to be guns involved.
about other races, particularly other colored races.
one side from you are
Careful. Oh, that's right. It's a different one. I mean, yeah, but it's a different person.
is because we're ashamed.
Having their many
which fear is like the root of all of the
Very flamboyant.
with each other. And the stereotypes that we bring, it's easier to believe a stereotype than actually be vulnerable and know the person or the value the person has created this. So fear is kind of like one of the factors that kind of roots in us. Like, I'd rather just
Yeah, it comes a time though it's hard to tell if it is the race or if it is the person.
It's evolution because when you protect the group that you're, protect your little primate.
For me.
All right, 1 minute warning, and then we'll gather back here.
We're conditioned. The other thing, the main thing, aside from everybody's just like,
right. Let us gather back as a whole group and move our chairs and everybody get oriented this way. You're going to get the opportunity to get back into the groups in about 15 to 20 minutes, but I have some basically summarizing that I'd love to do and then suggest a couple of different ways that we can move forward. So I'm going to keep vamping here for a few minutes until everybody's in place. And then when the time is right, I'll begin the last talk. So, great, Andy and Bill. Thank you, Margaret Lee. Ah. Life is complicated. I tell you. Yeah. David Brooks had this great article, opinion column a couple weeks ago where he talked about modern life is like death by 1,000 paper cuts. And it just often feels like that. Death by 1,000 paper cuts. All right. So I think it...
Well, we'll be back.
No. You guys will be back as a small group in 15 to 20. All right. So as I said before, we're doing a slightly different format. Dennis, are we almost ready to go live on YouTube? Just tell me when we were making the transition. We are on. Now, okay. All right, well, welcome then, everybody, to the 6th and final session of Transcending Contempt. It's been a good journey together. The purpose of this class was to figure out how we individually can become beacons of light and love in this election year of 2024, specifically by learning how to transcend contempt, on the assumption that already contempt is flying everywhere and it's going to get worse before it gets better. So how can we prepare ourselves to be strong beacons of light and love? And what I suggested, what I shared with all of us was 5 practices. Each of the 5 sessions had a practice that was associated with it. So in the first session, I invited us to practice WAG, wonder, attention, and gratitude. In the second session, I invited us to consider virtue, the practice of being good, and specifically to nurturing magnanimity, great strong-heartedness, as a virtue that could help us transcend contempt. In the third session, I invited us to steward our halo, our temporal halo, on the understanding that each of us has a temporal halo that's as unique to us as our fingerprint, and that coming to terms with our own temporal halo, who we are as a single individual, could be an essential piece of learning to transcend contempt, specifically by not getting hooked into the opinions of the public. So that was that practice. Then in the fourth session, we looked at loving ourselves, specifically through attending to 3 habits, 2 life-giving habits that brought fullness of life, 1 habit that we knew kind of sucked away life from us, left us feeling hollow. Can we strengthen the 2 good ones and do less of the thing that sucks life from us? And then finally, last week, we looked at loving our neighbor, and specifically through the practice of occasionally looking at somebody's face and thinking, this is a person, all in capital letters. And that is a way of revering the person that's before us, is made in the image and likeness of God. It's imitating the practice in some translations of Scripture of all capital letters Lord, covering up the name of God in Hebrew, which we revere by not speaking it. Same thing here with a person. This is a theotropic enigma, were the fun words that I shared with you last week. So this is the 6th and final session. What is the way forward for us? So I want to extend a specific invitation and then summarize what I think may be a practical way to continue doing the practices. So I want to invite you to consider becoming part of a small group of people who have taken this class to meet weekly on Zoom. And if that's of interest to you, I invite you to stay after class, and at 10:15 in this conversation area, I will see who's there and see if I can help facilitate some small groups. For those of you who are joining on Zoom or maybe watching this on YouTube later, send me an email at info@stpaulsanrafael.org, and I will see what I can do to hook you up with one of these Zoom groups that hopefully is continuing to talk about this. Why would you want to be in a small group of people who have taken this class? Well, so Wednesday is Ash Wednesday, which is the season of Lent. And what I'm suggesting is that for this season of Lent, this next 6 weeks, you meet with other people where you can talk about practicing WAG, and they're going to know what you mean. Because other people in your life are going to have no idea. So if you want to continue chewing on these thoughts and strengthening these practices, I think continuing to meet with a small group of other people who have been through this and encouraging each other is important. I'm going to be sharing with you a format that we call discipleship groups here as a way to do that. Why have this particular format of a discipleship group? Well, a few things. One is that by meeting for an hour, you just create an accountability group that you can come and you can have the conversation, how did things go this week, and provide support. The second is that the discipleship group format begins and ends with the convener reminding everybody that what is said in the group is said in confidentiality. So this is a place where you can be vulnerable and share things you wouldn't share in other contexts, because hopefully you're confident that people aren't going to go out and talk to their spouses or their friends or people in their church about, do you know what so-and-so said that she's struggling with? No. This is a place where this can be done in confidence, and you can be vulnerable and slowly build up your confidence. Finally, part of the format of the group is to say a bunch of sentences at the beginning, and one of the sentences is, by God's grace, I will do the work God is sending me to do this week. And what I'm suggesting is that perhaps for you, part of the work that God is sending you to do week by week is strengthening these practices that can help you transcend contempt and so be a beacon of light and love in this election year. Now, my learning, or part of my learning from teaching this class, is I believe that there are two practices that all of us are probably invited to engage in moving forward to help transcend contempt. And then, as my wife often mocks me for doing, I believe there's a third thing. There's always three things for me. If you hear my sermons, there's very often 3 points. I once had 4 points, and my wife nearly fell out of the pew. What, 4? But 3 is what most of us can handle and remember and actually engage with actively. So I think there's 2 that are probably common to all of us, and then the third is a kind of choose your own adventure. Like, here's a possibility for what the third thing might be. So the 2 practices I think we're all called to moving forward. The first one is to pay attention to your neighbor. And I suggested in the first class that of WAG, wonder, attention, and gratitude, that attention might actually be the through line. And I still continue to believe that to be the case. To pay attention to our neighbors, to the people that we are in relationship with, that we are interacting with day by day. That's where this starts. And furthermore, through the course of these sessions, I've laid out for you 3 different ways to understand that. One is the way of Simone Weil. And in the first session, there's the 1-page handout where I have a whole bunch of quotes of Simone Weil of what attention is. You may remember that on the stamp that honors her in France, it quotes her as, attention is the only faculty of the soul that gives us access to God. But there's also this sense in which attention, for Simone Weil, is something very understandable. It is what it was required in 4th grade when we first had to do long division. We all had that experience of having to pay full attention or else we weren't going to get it. And part of what Simone Weil said is that even if you get the wrong answer, it doesn't matter because you are starting to practice what it means to pay full attention. And of course, for our purposes, that eventually concludes in the most important use of attention, which is to pay attention to our neighbor. and ask either internally or even out loud, what are you going through? So Simone Weil's attention. I also suggested, both in that first session and then last week, what Christina Sharp called regard. And the example that she gave was the experience she had in the Tate Museum in London when she said hello to a black woman who was working at the cafeteria. The woman paid no attention to her. She had to repeat it several times, and finally the woman who was black said, "I'm sorry, were you speaking to me? I've been working here for months. Nobody has spoken to me." And she said, "Christina, I see you." And she said, "Yes, we see each other. Yes, we do." So that's a different kind of attention. It's not merely our neighbor, but it's the neighbor that we tend not to pay attention to. And I imagine that we all have people in our lives that are marginalized because they're homeless, because they're the service people, because they're whatever. And are we not paying attention? Can we pay attention? Can we get into practice of paying attention to those folks who society, the false human hierarchy, would have us ignore? So that's practice number 2. And then practice number 3 is where it really does get into transcending contempt, where it's this invitation to really view each human being as made in the image and likeness of God through the little tool of capital P, capital E, capital R, capital S, capital O, capital N. So that's the first practice I think is common to all of us. The second practice I think is common to all of us is to be a good steward of our temporal halo, which means not being like me when I go to the driveway and hop into my Honda and pay no attention to any of my instruments, but merely push down on the brake, hit the button, hit the radio, and I'm out in 30 seconds. Don't be like that. Instead, I invite you to be like Jessica, who remember, she's the one who's taking the flight lessons, and she told us that she takes 45 minutes, because she's still learning, to check all the instruments before she flies, because she knows that if all of those gauges aren't right, she could potentially die. And as several people told me afterwards, that's how John Denver died. He forgot. He was in a new plane and he didn't know that where to look for the instrument to tell him whether or not there was gas or fuel in the second tank. And so when he was up flying, he pushed the button to have the second fuel tank go, and there was no fuel in it because he failed to check. Now, I don't think failing to check in the morning our temporal halo is going to lead to death, but I do think it's worthwhile getting in the habit every morning of checking your temporal halo. And you might remember that the practice was to think about the people in our past. I suggested grandparents, but the people who formed us. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And then to the right, to pray for, as if it's a halo all around us, past, future, family, friends, and to pray for the family and friends that are in our lives. And then specifically, why this is about transcending contempt is 2 things. One is knowing that some of those people who you love or wish to love are somewhere else on the political spectrum than you are. And so charity begins with the people that we're already in relationship with. And the practice of bringing them up in our hearts on a regular basis can be transformative. Janie was reflecting on this with me, and she talked about a novel that she'd been reading, which I can try and summarize, or Janie, do we have the microphone? Would you be willing to do it, or do you want me to summarize it?
Sure, I can do it.
Okay, yeah. Let's grab the microphone, and I think this is specifically what it is that we're trying to do with this temporal halo exercise, thinking about family and friends and knowing that they have political beliefs that are different than ours. Janie, will you tell that story, please?
So I was reading a novel last week. It's called Hello Beautiful, and it's a takeoff on Little Women, and it focuses mainly on 4 sisters. And as they grew up, one of the daughters was reflecting on how her mother treated her when she became pregnant at age 17, and her mother just completely disowned her. Her mother moved away. She never saw her mother for years and years. And the daughter was reflecting on this and said that she wanted to forgive her mother because she wanted to keep loving her.
Spot on. Wanted to forgive because wants to love. That's what's behind at least part of what's going on with the temporal halo exercise, nurturing the love that we have for these family and friends who may have different political beliefs than we do. The other purpose, though, and this is akin to it, is you may remember that this is also partly inspired by Kierkegaard, who wants to make us aware and who wants to make us single individuals, not caught up in that monstrous abstraction, the public. And the public is that where everybody has opinions but nobody owns them. And it's the understanding also that each of us in this room, each human being is very susceptible to being caught up in opinions and what the public believes. And if we are spending time each morning stewarding our temporal halo, we are more likely to become aware that we are single individuals and not we aren't built out of these opinions that we have or that consume us or that hook us, enabling us to be more loving to ourselves, but then also to our neighbor. What are you going through? So I think those are the two exercises that I, at least, am making a commitment to continue to practice. Attend to your neighbor, steward your temporal halo. The third, I think, is a choose your own adventure. I have laid down a lot for you, and I know that. It's been really dense. So I think we would each do best by picking one of three practices moving forward. The first is inspired by the second session, where I talked about virtue. You may remember that I talked about being made in the image and likeness of God. We are each made in the image of God, and that's true of each human being. This is why we're all the same, on the same ontological plane, each made in the image. We're each also made in the likeness, but the likeness is how we participate in God's goodness, beauty, truth. How do we do that? Well, the classic language is virtue, and I've suggested two particular virtues that I think are good to practice. One is magnanimity, great-heartedness. The other is hope. You may remember that I taught as part of the Stewarding Your Halo that hope is akin to love because it's a desire. It's akin to wonder because we don't know. It's akin to attention because it's unhurried. And it's akin to gratitude because it's labor toward a gift. Well, I read something this week that reinforced this. Abbot Chapman, you may remember the preternatural piece that I shared with you. Anyway, Abbot Chapman said that hope is the most practical of virtues, and it is through hope that we grow in love. The more we hope, the more we love. So I think there's something very real there, and that implies that hope and magnanimity are close to each other. If that's the path you want to take, the virtue path, I recommend, it's hopelessly gendered, but The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. And particularly, it's a series of 3 essays. The first essay is Men Without Chests. And it talks about how we are due in our schools such a poor job of developing people's hearts. And yet that's essential. That we're great at developing their minds. We're great at stimulating and feeding the guts. But what we really need to do as a culture is learn how to strengthen our hearts. So if the virtue path is the way you want to go, I recommend this book. So virtue. Path number 2 is from session number, what was it? Session 4, the habits, fullness and hollowness. So as I said before, I sent you out paying attention to 2 habits that bring you fullness of life. And I talked about the more I do contemplative prayer, the more full of life I feel. So I'm going to commit to a second sit in the afternoon. The more I hike, particularly among trees, the more alive I feel. So I'm going to do more of that. And I got to tell you, you may remember that my negative habit was checking 12 different websites every day for news. I've quit doing that, and I love it. I'm going to continue with Lent. I feel so much more like alive and attentive and non-anxious. I still know what the news is, but I check once in the morning and done. It's so good. So anyway, that's the other path that you can take, is to continue to pay attention to your habits, your daily habits, and which ones are bringing you life, which ones aren't. If you're going to go the habits, the 3 habits route, I recommend this book, From Burned Out to Beloved, by Bethany Dearborn Heiser. And it's focused on precisely this metaphor of fullness of life. This is a guidebook for caregivers, and its emphasis is on how caregivers need to enter into the caregiving with fullness of life so that they can share out of fullness with generosity and not out of a burned out place. And this book is filled with little exercises that can help you enter into fullness of life so that you can be available to other people. So this is the book I recommend if you're going to go the habits route. And then the third route, and this is the one as I shared with you last week, this is my cutting edge, this is where I want to continue to explore. The third route is race. How to encounter and be in that conversation. And what I suggested last week was attending to the voices of James Baldwin, and particularly his understanding for those of us who have to or do check the label, the box white when we have to. Can we go from being trapped in a history that we don't understand to free? That's what James Baldwin invites us to. And then Christina Sharp, I took her to invite us, to going from guilt to grief, specifically through being someone whose life makes one complicit to one who is creatively entangled in finding a different way. That's the language I'm wrestling with. And I suggested that neither James Baldwin nor Christina Sharp, as far as I knew, were Christian. And so the Christian path, they were like Moses to me. They brought me right to the River Jordan, but didn't get me across to the Promised Land. And to get to the Promised Land, I needed Jesus. And that's where I suggested the person exercise as a fundamental way of entering into that conversation. So I personally wanted to continue to explore that. As I reflect on it, I'm making some other connections. You know, if any of the rest of you want to continue that path, that might be one of the small groups. So there we have it. This is the summary of the teaching of all 6. So number 1, is it the case that attending to our neighbor is one of the practices moving forward? Is it the case that stewarding our halo with a particular attention to our family and friends and loving them, getting into that practice each day might be a second? And then might pursuing the path of virtue, pursuing the path of habits, pursuing the path of exploring race in this different way, one of those 3, could that be a way that you're invited to transcend contempt? That's it. May we be human beacons of light and love in a year that will often feel inhumane. Thank you for walking through these sessions with me. I have been a learner alongside with you, and that we've shared this together, I feel strengthened, and I hope you do too. I want to give a special thanks to Judy Rowcliffe, who couldn't be here today, but she was the one who always prepared that incredible spread. So thank you, Judy Rowcliffe. Thank you, Tanner, who was here every week, setting up and hosting the Zoom group and helping in innumerable ways. Thank you to Dennis, who set up this amazing way so that those of you who are watching can participate. Also, special thanks to Mike Green, who stepped in when Dennis couldn't be here and helped out in various ways. And then to all of you, part of the ethos that I love of this church is people just roll up their sleeves and help, which so many of you have in one way or another. This has truly been a team effort. So thank you. Again, welcome to those of you who are joining us on Zoom or perhaps on YouTube later. If you are, again, interested in being part of this one of these ongoing Zoom groups, please do email me at info@stpaulssanrafael.org. Thank you. God bless you all, and Godspeed.